So I'm very excited to be here today and share some of the lessons that we've learned from our field studies, especially long-term experiments in the Arctic. And so we're going to start off with, so we're going to be talking about carbon and specifically terrestrial carbon balances. So the only way for carbon to get into ecosystems, as you all know, is through photosynthesis, and then the way out is through respiration. And the fluxes are almost balanced. For the Arctic, we're talking about 1 to 3 petagrams a year of carbon. And for the respiration part, most of it is coming from soils, and half of it in the soil can be from root respiration, while the rest comes from microbes. So it's actually very difficult to understand how the carbon budget of the land surface is changing, because the changes in soil are a small difference between these two large fluxes, and soils are very spatially heterogeneous, especially in the cryoturbation zone in the Arctic. And then we also have disturbances like fires that lead to losses. For the last 20 years, our best estimates are that the Arctic is currently still a small sink for carbon, but the radiative balance is about neutral, so there's the global warming potential is about neutral. And there's very large disagreement between bottom-up and top-down estimates. This is, I just thought I'd show you some models because you guys like modeling. So both for the CMIP-5 and CMIP-6 models, for the North American terrain, we're expecting, or we're observing this tipping point in the Arctic carbon balance around 2050 to 2080. And this is a persistent feature in the models. And it basically means that the response, so this will lead to the Arctic likely becoming a source of carbon sometime in the next century. And this is driven by the thermal response of respiration, which is an exponential relationship with temperature, overwhelming the greater uptake of photosynthesis during a warmer growing season, a longer growing season, and also because of CO2 fertilization. However, none of these models have the ability currently to include abrupt climate change, abrupt permafrost interactions. So while some of them have fire in them, the fire doesn't trigger responses in the permafrost. So they all assume basically thawing from the top down. And so overall, we still don't have a very good handle on the carbon budget of the Arctic. And the permafrost carbon is really the big elephant in the tundra here. There's about 1,000 petagrams of carbon in the top 3 meters. And this means that about 30% of the land carbon is in a very small part of the land surface. Most of this carbon is very old, from the Pleistocene. And if we put all of this top 3 meter carbon in the air, we would have an additional 3 degrees of warming, roughly, because we would double the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's a potentially very large feedback. And our best estimates right now are that we're going to be losing 5 to 15% of this pool by the end of this century at a rate of about 0.5 to 2 petagrams per year, so about 70 to 250 petagrams or so on. So this is a rate of loss per year that's much smaller than fossil fuel emissions, but as a whole, it's the equivalent of another country that's not part of climate agreements. So we really need to figure this out. And before I talk about permafrost, I would like to talk a little bit about the other part of the carbon balance, the input. So I've been grappling with the question of what are the implications of vegetation change for the carbon balance, but also for the trajectory of permafrost thaw. And I think that part has been a little bit understudied in my particular field. And this is really important because maybe you're familiar with these zones. So the permafrost region is usually divided into 3 zones: the continuous permafrost zone, the discontinuous permafrost zone, and the sporadic permafrost zone coming down from the pole. And in the continuous permafrost zone, it basically is cold enough for permafrost to form and exist no matter what you do to the surface. So unless you put a really big lake on the surface, you will have permafrost. However, in the discontinuous permafrost zone, the climate today is already too warm for permafrost to form. The only reason that we find permafrost there is because of surface properties. So we have climate-controlled permafrost in the far north, and then ecosystem protected or ecosystem driven permafrost in the discontinuous permafrost zone, which is most of the boreal region with the forest. So we only find permafrost on north facing slopes or in black spruce forests with thick moss understories and so on. As we're moving into this warmer climate, much of the permafrost region will become like the discontinuous zone. So surface properties will be really important in controlling where we find permafrost and how fast we're going to be losing permafrost. At the moment, all the models are, except for very aggressive warming scenarios, are predicting an increase in vegetation in the Arctic, and we're already seeing a greening of large parts of the tundra. And field observations show that this is basically driven by an expansion of deciduous shrubs. So trees are not yet making it into the tundra, but the shrubs that are there, the deciduous ones, are getting more numerous, bigger, and taller. And so you can also see that the observations are a little bit biased towards certain parts of the Arctic. But that's a general feature. And this has long fascinated us because shrubs have a lot of important feedbacks for the carbon cycle, but also for the permafrost. So you can imagine if you put a 1 or 2 meter tall shrub on the tundra, you're shading the ecosystem of the soil during the summer. And you also have higher rates of transpiration because you have higher rates of photosynthesis in deciduous plants than the sedges that were there before. And the one important feedback that has been observed and studied recently is this, the fact that tall vegetation will trap snow. So in the tundra, usually like if you're walking around there, you're the tallest feature, and snow gets blown around a lot. It takes a long time for the snowpack to settle in the winter. And by having these taller features on the landscape, we're creating patches of deep snow on the landscape. And so a few years ago, Elchin Jafarov worked in the Seward Peninsula and showed in this model that the existence of tall alder shrubs that basically creates a snowdrift in the discontinuous permafrost zone can trigger relatively rapid thaw of permafrost. And so we have localized loss of permafrost within a few decades. So the vegetation was rapidly increasing the thaw rate. And what fascinated me in this model was the way they drew this feature here. So here's the slope, and here you can see the increase in snow from normal snow to 3 times more snow in the model where the shrubs are. But the other thing that's in this model is that the organic layer of the soil, so the decomposing leaves and so on, is much thicker, kind of at the top of the hill and the bottom, and under the shrubs you also almost have no organic layer. And we had a hard time figuring out, so I know this is real, but there's very little field observation to back this up. And I was always fascinated with how much of the ground effects were then driven by the lack of insulation from the organic layers versus the snow. So we've tried to find sites in the Arctic that have actively undergone tall alder expansion, and we settled on the site here in the Saguaro Bluffs area on the north slope, where dendrochronology has shown that alder shrubs have been there for about 100 years, and they've been getting a lot bigger and numerous. And we used NDVI to identify sites of rapid expansion and sites that have been stable and are also alder-free. And we looked at the soil properties and the properties of the alder. And what we found was kind of what was expected from the model, the fact that the presence of these shrubs led to about a 25% reduction in organic layer thickness. And this is, it's very noisy, but it's consistent, and it's the second study where we found this effect. So tall shrubs, specifically alder, are associated with much thinner organic layers. And surprisingly, we didn't find an increase in thaw depth under the shrubs. So the typical way to measure thaw depths is at the end of the summer to walk around with a tile probe and go in until you hit the ice, basically, or the frozen ground. And there's no correlation between biomass or cover in now the second study. However, if you think about how this is done, it's actually a misleading measurement because we've lost part of the land surface. So if you can put the thaw probe into the same depth as before, but you lost the organic layer, then you effectively have thawed into the deeper mineral soil. So I think that this effect of the deeper thaw is being missed by a lot of our observing networks that use this technique. And then we put our observations into the Geophysical Institute permafrost model and parameterized it with local weather and climate data. And you can see here the control. This is time on the x-axis here from January through December, and this is soil depth to about 70 centimeters. And you can see that extra snow, less organic layer, or warming all lead to deeper thaw of the soil. And the biggest effect is when we combine these things. So basically the shrubs getting in there, reducing the organic layer, lead to additional warming. So it really confirms these original findings. And then the other study that I wanted to share on vegetation is from the high Arctic, so shifting gears now to Greenland. This is a really unique experiment that ran for 15 years near Thule Air Base. And it's unique in the sense that there have been lots of warming experiments in the Arctic, but very few of them have been really far north, and most of them didn't add water. So here we had 2 warming scenarios, 2 and 4 degrees, and we had also 50% additional water in the summer. And the plots are stratified by vegetated and bare soil. So these are pictures from May and or June, and you can see how green these sites are. What we found was that warming and warming plus water increased respiration rates, and the different colors here indicate different years of measurement. However, the plants were really driven by the water addition, which kind of makes sense. It's a polar semi-desert, so they're water limited. So if you warm them up, they're not going to grow much more, but the water addition made a big difference. And what we found was that after 10 years of this experiment, warming alone had decreased the summer sink by about 50%, but the wetting in combination with warming increased the sink strength by an order of magnitude. And after 15 years, we had to unfortunately harvest the experiment, and we found a 400% expansion of plant biomass. So in conclusion for the plant part, I'd like you to kind of know that there's tundra greening going on. It's mostly shrubification, but our observations are somewhat biased towards the low Arctic. Tall alder shrubs will basically amplify the thaw by reducing organic layers, which also reduces carbon storage in soils, and that the measurements of thaw depths are underestimating the changes that we're seeing in the field because they're not accounting for changes in soil composition. And I think that the increase in precipitation together with warming will lead to much higher productivity in the landscapes that are emerging from the ice and glaciers right now. So we have very few observations from the high Arctic and from the dry landscapes on both poles where the glaciers are retreating. And these could be important carbon sinks in the Arctic, offsetting some of the losses, but we have almost no data, especially for the soils. All right, so now to the permafrost. A big question has been how we can separate emissions of this ancient carbon in CO2 fluxes. And it's important to do that and not just look at fluxes because the carbon from permafrost is from the Pleistocene, basically, or thousands of years old. So you're adding carbon to the system, just like fossil fuel combustion, right? So it's important to separate that from other CO2. So we can do this with radiocarbon because we know that plants are basically taking up CO2 from the air and then respiring it the same year. And that carbon looks like atmospheric CO2. And atmospheric CO2 carries a unique radiocarbon signature. So it's naturally labeled with radiocarbon. And then in the 50s and 60s, we added additional radiocarbon to the air. So we know the history of radiocarbon in air for the last 60 years, but also for the last 50,000 years quite well. So we know what the plants are doing. And you can use a simple isotope mass balance to identify contributions from plants and microbes, assuming that plants have a known signature, and microbes have to wait for material to get in the soil before they can respire it, so it's a bit older. So if you go back a few decades, it gets more enriched, up with the bomb spike, but then if you go back in time, it gets much older than the plants would be. And so we can do this in the field by measuring the radiocarbon signature of the respired CO2. We know the plants, and we can identify what the microbes are eating from incubations, and we can put that together to identify the contributions from either source. And if we know what the microbes are doing, we can also see what type of carbon they're eating. So are they eating carbon that was recently from a plant, UCI, or is it really old permafrost carbon? So we have these three pools in the soil that have a really unique structure, a unique isotope composition. Okay, so this method has been very successfully used in the last 30 years and really transformed our understanding of carbon cycling in the terrestrial system. And the way this usually works is that we measure fluxes. So we put what we call a chamber on the ground. We let CO2 out of the soil, accumulate in the chamber, and then we capture it on either molecular sieve or an evacuated canister. We also have soil gas wells on the ground where we can slowly pump or suck the pore space gas into a canister. We take that home, we combine that with incubations and figure out where the CO2 is coming from. And this sampling was traditionally done about once a month during the growing season only, and each sample represents about an hour or a day worth of carbon fluxes. And so what you get from this is basically here's time, here's radiocarbon. You can see that most of the time during the growing season you have young carbon coming out. If it's above this atmosphere line, it's from the microbes. So you can kind of see what's going on in the ground, and occasionally you will capture older carbon. So this method was very successfully used everywhere, including the boreal, and then I tried to work with it in Greenland and also in the lower Arctic and Alaska, and it became really, really tricky for a number of reasons. First of all, you need relatively large samples for this method, and the fluxes of carbon in the Arctic are very low because it's cold, and often the soils are very fluffy, so it's easy to measure a flux over a few minutes, and then you leave the chamber there, have lunch or do something else, you come back an hour later, and the concentration of CO2 in the chamber is atmospheric because it just got flushed from the side. And unless you drive like a meter deep collar in there, you constantly have lateral flushing. And the other thing was that we have to accumulate the CO2 in the chamber to relatively high levels in order to get enough and separate it from air CO2. And I think that disturbs the gradient of CO2 in the profile. So I think we had different results from gas wells and from the surface fluxes because we were disturbing the natural gradient of CO2. And the third thing was that we had several situations in the high Arctic where the type of, or during specific times of the year, where the CO2 we were capturing in the field was outside the expected end members. And I couldn't tell if it was coming from deeper down or if it was because soil samples didn't account for all the cryoturbation that was going on. So the method didn't really work. The second challenge that we had was that all the measurements in the past for all of these methods have been done in the growing season, assuming that that's when we see maximum emissions, because the soils are most deeply thawed in August, so that's when we go and measure fluxes and their isotopes. However, our advances in measuring greenhouse gas emission fluxes from ecosystems have shown, they're now year-round, and they've shown that there's considerable fluxes in the fall and slowly leaking of CO2 in the winter, and together that exceeds the uptake of CO2 during the short growing season. And that was a really regime shift in the early 2010s when that became possible. So we now think that actually the northern permafrost region is already a source of CO2 because of the fall and winter emissions. So we needed a method that could figure out what was being respired during that year. Was it just dead roots or was it permafrost carbon? So we tried a number of different things. The first thing was to take our chambers to Svalbard and then let them snow in over the winter. So we come back, flush the chamber with CO2-free air, let it accumulate, and then take a sample. And that was miserable in the fall, and it was really difficult in January. And okay, so the solution that we came up with was to build a passive CO2 sampler that doesn't disturb the CO2 gradient in the soil. What we did is we built a new inlet system. So this is a very special type of silicone tubing that's waterproof, and you bury it in the ground, and CO2 can diffuse through the tubing. And then we showed that you can capture the CO2 either in canisters or in molecular sieve traps. And these traps are designed with a different molecular sieve. So basically, it will capture the CO2 that diffuses into the sampler, and the uptake rate in this trap is linear over weeks and months. So we can get a time-integrated sample of CO2 emitted over 2 months from a certain depth in the soil. And we did, and so we were able to show that this works. And so we get time-integrated samples from multiple depths. And so we deployed this in the most common tundra type in on the north slope here at multiple depths, and we co-buried CO2 and temperature and moisture sensors, and then we let this go and analyzed it for radiocarbon in our lab. And then we, what I'm going to show in the next few slides is data collected over 2 years, over days to months, and then combined into 1 year. So what you will see is the land surface is up here. This axis is time from January through December, and this axis here is depth. Okay. So first I want to show you the temperature record. We're assuming that the permafrost will freeze shut in the fall from the permafrost and from the top down. And this is what we found. And this is a site in northern Alaska that hasn't thawed yet. So what you see is that it's warm kind of in the summer, and then the air gets rapidly very cold down to -20, -30 degrees Celsius, and the snowpack builds up. And in the soil, you can see that we have these white colors here showing that the soil is at 0 degrees Celsius. And we were able to show that the soil in northern Alaska isn't freezing until January at the depth of about 1 meter. That was kind of unexpected. So we have these prevailing zero curtain conditions. And then what we also could show is that CO2 was building up under the snowpack. So these red colors show very high concentrations of CO2. This is a combination of the pore space being squeezed shut by freezing, and also the trapping of CO2 in the ground by the snowpack. If we put it all together here, on the left you see the temperature record again, now down to 40 centimeters. And this is the measurement of our soil CO2 data. And then on the right here is basically the soil record corrected for the plant respiration. So I take the field measured data and remove the signature of roots. And this is then what the microbes were doing. One thing you can see is that the darkest colors, which are the oldest carbon, are visible in August. So this is expected because it's the deepest thaw. However, at this time period, you can't see that signature very well at the surface because the microbes in the upper part of the soil and the roots are also very, very active. But this happens. And then if we go through the fall and winter, and you just look at any of these lines here, these rows, you can see that the color changes from green to light green to white to brown and so on at every depth. And this means that the CO2 at a certain depth just became older and older and older and older. And so we interpreted this as the microbes basically eat DOC, they consume DOC carbon during the summer that's coming down through the soil. And then at some point, the top starts freezing and the bottom starts slowly freezing. But this DOC stream from the roots, the plants stop growing and the DOC stream slows down. So it's a bit like the microbes are trapped at home for a week, and initially you still have Uber Eats, and then they don't come anymore. So you end up eating through your freezer. And this was kind of unexpected, because in the past, we would use soil incubations from soil samples collected in the summer to model this component, and that didn't work. So we actually have to model the microbial flux using just temperature as the main constraint. And so it revealed that really the microbes are eating a lot larger carbon sources. And the main thing is, if you think about this part that's unfrozen in the fall period, that is carbon that's hundreds of years old. So even though this site hasn't thawed yet, it's still in permafrost, the signature indicates that during the fall, when fluxes are increasing, we're losing older and older carbon. Okay. So we have a new tool. We can directly measure permafrost emissions now. We have evidence that the non-growing season is a critical period for fluxes and for transferring old carbon into the modern atmosphere. And microbes are eating much more different types of carbon than we anticipated. Right. So, but what you guys are probably really interested in is the future of permafrost. And we try to capture that by looking at a long-term experiment that looks at changes in snow cover. This is a unique experiment. It's one of several long-running snow fence experiments. So they build a fence, and it creates a snow drift behind it. And we measure it in this intermediate zone, kind of 30 meters behind the fence. And this experiment ran in northern Alaska for 25 years. And you can see that we have more snow in the snow treatment, and we have a slightly deeper active layer here. And then what happened was that within 20 years, the system converted from a productive, like the most common grassland in the Arctic, into a shrubland. And so we have higher carbon uptake. But at the same time, this is the fluxes here in the winter. We had 3 times as high carbon losses during the winter. And since our study, other people have confirmed that the site is converted into a carbon source. So it's a net source of carbon to the atmosphere year-round, even though it's become a more productive ecosystem. And we have significant changes of carbon storage in soil. So this is the control. Here's the snow. The left and right direction shows % carbon in the soil. The colors show age of carbon, and the lines show density. Main points are that the active layer is a bit deeper, but the type of carbon and the organization of carbon is very different. So we have this bump of carbon here suddenly. Some of it is younger, but a lot of it is really old. So what happened is that, and then the surface is also compressed. So what happened is that we had ground ice thaw in the site, compaction from the snow, subsidence, and then you have to imagine that in this deeper land surface, this material now is in the active layer and available for decomposition. That is several thousand-year-old carbon. It's now in the active layer. And in the control, you find that at 1.20 meter depth. So within 20 years, with a little bit extra snow, we've converted the ecosystem into a different type of ecosystem, and we got this deep, ancient carbon into the active layer. When we look at the emissions, this is the control. It looks kind of like what I showed you when we did the method development. So we have young carbon in the summer, gets older with depths, it gets older in the winter at every depth. In the snow, this stuff is 3,000-year-old CO2 all year round. The soil doesn't freeze anymore. Carbon is really old. And even during the growing season, the CO2 that's coming out is hundreds of years old. I've never seen that before. That was like 20 years of snow did that. So we're very concerned that snow will have like extra snow in the Arctic. And I know the records are not very consistent right now. We're lacking good snow observations, but it's very obvious that additional snow will have the ability to very quickly accelerate loss of permafrost. And we already have evidence of thaw slumps near Tulek that have formed. So I am personally more and more convinced that we will see active thaw from now within a few decades, driven by changes in snow and temperature, and that the models are underrepresenting the emissions going forward. A few more minutes? 1 minute? Okay. One more thing that I'd like to mention that might be good or bad. So, quick question. We're next to the San Andreas Fault, right? Do you know what plate boundary we're on? Best guess? Pacific plate, North American plate. No, North American, Pacific plate. So we're moving north. Okay. So when I first moved here, it's like, this is great. I can go to the plate boundary and stand on the plates, right? One North American, North Pacific. And the geologists would have rolled their eyes and say, no, you can't do that. Because really, plate boundaries look like this, like hundreds miles of mess. And so I show this because I think this is what we've been doing with the permafrost to some extent. So our emission models are all based on incubation studies. And incubation studies use soil cores by people who mostly have been collecting these cores at the end of the summer. And we dig as deep as we can. And the upper part then we call active layer, and the deeper part we call permafrost. And by mining the databases, we find that most of our mineral soils are less than 1 meter deep. So the active layer is like 50, 60 centimeters, should work. However, the soil physicists have long told us that you can't have a two-pole model to represent permafrost. You just need a few warm summers and the permafrost would go away. What you need is this transition zone, and it's usually identified by the presence of suspended ice. And what I think that the biogeochemistry community has underappreciated is that this material isn't ice. So if you think about your freezer and you have like leaky food in there, and then the power goes out and then comes back on and it goes out again, it happens sometimes. So most of the time the power's on, so it doesn't really thaw, but sometimes it does. Over time you get a layer of ice building up at the bottom of your freezer. But if you really think about that, you would never thaw that and drink it because it's not water ice. It's like everything that came out of your freezer. And this is what we've been doing in this layer. So this transition zone builds up over centuries, decades, centuries, millennia. And I think it's full of microbes and carbon. And this is the layer that's going into the talik when we thaw permafrost. It's about the right level, and I think it has the potential to become this permafrost hot zone. Okay. With radiocarbon, I'm just going to put the last slide here. Looking at, this is a core from Tulik, just bulk radiocarbon of the soil. You can see that we have our modern carbon up here. This is age, this is depth. And then we have this zone here, which is all the same age roughly. And then down here we have stuff that's all the same age, and it's 8,000 years old. And in between we have this linear mixing. In the field and over like talking to people, we think that the active layer is about at 50 to 60 centimeters. Based on this, it's at least, it's deeper, and if you add the transition zone, it's double. So I think that our incubation experiments are all kind of from this layer. And if you imagine that DOC freezes onto the permafrost table, obviously when you now thaw this out, you get a lot of flux response. So I think our initial ideas of permafrost thaw and emissions are correct, but I don't think we have taken deep enough cores to know what will happen later. Like we're going to thaw through this layer, and it will not form during this rapid thaw, but we don't really know what the emissions will be from this layer. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Claudia, for the nice talk. We have time for questions. Go ahead, Patrick.
Very interesting. I guess I get kind of two questions. One is, how do you decide where to go and dig these cores? You could go a lot of places, but you can't go everywhere, obviously. And then similarly going forward, you showed about, the discontinuous versus the continuous permafrost. I was curious, like, where are the places that you would prioritize, or do we need to prioritize to continue the monitoring and understand how the permafrost is changing?
Yeah, so I think a priority would be the landscapes that were not covered by glaciers during the last ice age. so the Yadoma landscapes, because they contain a lot of potentially mobile carbon. So that's a key priority. And then in terms of the sink, I think we need to include the high Arctic and the landscapes that are emerging from the retreating glaciers. And then peatlands. And I think we have pretty good handle on peatlands.
Hi, great talk. So you mentioned that you have a pretty good evidence or intuition that models are underrepresenting the emission by the loss of permafrost. So is anyone working on correcting that in the models, or do you have any idea or intuition how to approach that?
Yeah, so the Woodwell Climate Research Center and also the group from Helene Genet at UAF, they're, for example, UAA, Fairbanks, they are working on that. So there are several groups that are trying to incorporate talc formation and abrupt thaw into models. But we don't have enough field observations to constrain these models yet. So we need better observations of how temperature and moisture profiles are changing, for example, after fire, and then whether those soils recover or not to develop these models. So it's a combination of the modeling effort and very targeted field observations. And I think that we need to collect deep cores as soon as we can now, because they're an amazing archive of what these landscapes have looked like in the past, right? You can see past disturbance to the permafrost at depths, and these cores will disappear. It's like an ice core where you're losing the top.
Hi, thank you. That was really cool. I had a question about the observational time series from the snow transition period. So that's a fairly long time series, and you kind of showed like a mean snapshot. Do you have enough information from that time series to say something about like how long would it take for a landscape like that to sort of use up all of its old carbon? Like how long would that process of sort of emptying out, I guess, a changed landscape take?
Haven't done that yet.
No. Okay.
It's a good idea. It's a good idea. So we have put the data in a model, and so there's this effort by Carlos Sierra at the Max Planck Institute in Jena to integrate system age and mean transit times into models, and we have achieved that for this site, but we haven't taken it further than that.
Cool. Thank you.
Go ahead. Would you mind using the microphone, please?
You mentioned that the goal should be looking at places that were unglaciated during the last glacial period. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the ages of the carbon that you have dug to or found, because it seemed like at least some of them, even the very old carbon, has been deposited since the glaciers retreated from these areas, and sort of what, how you understand the deposition, like preservation of the carbon and now unburial in the context of sort of that climate change since the last glacial and the Holocene optimum.
That's a good point. Yeah, so these sites are depositional landscape that had the landscape itself is older than 50,000 years. These are moraine deposits, and then there's less on top of that. So they underwent transitions. The site has polluted over time. So I need to think about that. So this is not the age of the carbon in the soil, it's the stuff that's being respired, right? So it's, I guess it would be more like this record. So here, this carbon is really, really old. This is this is Pleistocene, but you don't see that in the CO2 because that's then mixed with other carbon pools in the soil. Does that make sense?
Yeah, how old do you think, how old is the oldest carbon that you take?
The loess, I think the loess deposits are multiple meters deep, and they go very far back, past 50,000 years.
Just a reminder for people who are online, we can also see if you have a question, just raise your hand. But Claudia, maybe I'll ask one more. You showed a couple different mechanisms, the greening, which would actually be a carbon sink, and the snow, which is potentially a source of carbon. Do we feel like we have a good understanding of what the net response will be over longer time periods?
I think for the higher, so for the boreal, at the moment, the plants are kind of winning the game unless we have continued high fire disturbance. For the tundra, I think we're neutral to negative already. So that would be my guess. And I don't think that the plants are able to overcome these emissions. So maybe there was some effort to see, so we don't have a lot of estimates to understand the biomass increase relative to thaw, but if the soil is slowly thawing from the top down, and in the same time you have a more productive ecosystem, then I guess our CMAP models that I showed, they're more or less right. But if we see this kind of more abrupt thaw, then you have rapid mobilization of high carbon pools, and that will, I mean, we know this site has already become a source, and that's now. Right? So I think it's really a priority to get the precipitation projections right. I know this was a lot and lots of different things. I was hoping that you can also ask me any question on carbon cycling or permafrost, and I'll try to answer it. My main point was that I think that we are not at a time period anymore where we can assume that the land is going to do its thing and continue to act as it has as a sink. I think we're almost there where it's not.
Okay. Actually, we'll hold that question. We'll come back to it a little bit later. Okay, Claudia, thanks so much for your presentation. Thanks.